sort it out. And this event is being recorded. You will be able to watch it on the New City Arts YouTube page later this week. My name is Lindsay Leahy. I am the program manager for New City Arts. If you don't know us, we're an arts organization and we run a number of community programs in Charlottesville, including a space called Welcome Gallery downtown. And that's where you can find the work that we're talking about tonight. The exhibit is up through next Thursday, October 28, and you can learn more about our open hours and how to see the exhibit on our website. I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now so that you can get more information about that. And I'm going to drop some more links in the chat later this evening relevant to this. A little bit about the exhibition. Situated Knowledge brings together 3 artists who were invited by New City Arts to make works connected to monuments. All 3 of these artists have spent formative years in Charlottesville and have a shared interest in local, embodied, and situated knowledge. The exhibit features work by Patrick Costello, who earned a bachelor's in printmaking from the University of Virginia in 2008. Marissa Williamson, who was UVA's Ruffin Distinguished Artist in Residence in 2018 and returned this year as an assistant professor of visual art with a research focus on Blackness. And of course, tonight's guest, Sandy William IV, who earned a BFA from UVA in 2016. Here's a bit of the exhibition statement, which was written by Marissa Williamson to give some context. The artists experiment with gestures that remediate erasure, taking into account the unaccounted for. They engage in a certain type of feminist archaeology, a practice of dismantling that which was designed to hide and to obscure. At the same time, the works cannot hide the struggle. Our problem, to summarize Donna Haraway's thesis in Situated Knowledges, the science question in feminism and the privilege of partial perspective, is how to have simultaneously a traumatic knowledge of painful legacies and at the same time not be defined, disillusioned, and dismantled by that knowledge. Situated Knowledge is presented by the fund at ACF and sponsored by Lisa M. Drain, and we want to thank them for their support. Let's dive in. So I'm going to introduce both of the artists and then turn it over. Sandy Williams IV is an artist and educator currently based in Richmond. Sandy likes to task audiences with agency in order to generate public and private opportunities for collaborative engagement. Sandy is currently an assistant professor of art at the University of Richmond, the recipient of the New York Community Trust Van Leer Fellowship, as well as the VMFA Artist Fellowship. Sandy has been a resident at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, SOMA in Mexico City, Acre in Chicago, among other residencies. They have exhibited at the Institute of Contemporary Art at VCU, the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, the Harnett Museum of Art at the University of Richmond, Nada House in New York City, DeBoer Gallery in Los Angeles, Springsteen Gallery in Baltimore, and New Release in New York City. And they have had solo shows at Reynolds Gallery in Richmond and here in Charlottesville at 2nd Street Gallery. The work they are showing tonight is part of Wax Monuments, an ongoing series of objects that were created within conversations about public space. And it was seeing one of these pieces in last year's Socrates Sculpture Park Fellowship Monuments Now exhibition that led to this group show. And Dr. Lisa Woolfork is an associate professor of English at the University of Virginia, where she specializes in African-American literature and culture, and the author of Embodying American Slavery in Contemporary Culture. As a member of the inaugural class of UVA College Fellows, Dr. Woolfork created 2 new courses for first-year students, Race, Racism, Colony, and Nation, and Making the Invisible Visible. These courses address a variety of systemic inequity, including racism and white supremacy. Her scholarship focuses on Black women, writers, trauma theory, and practices of liberation. Dr. Woolfork is a scholar, sewist, and community organizer and podcaster. She is the convener and founder of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. She is also the host producer of Stitch Please, a weekly audio podcast that centers Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. The podcast is heard in 94 countries and maintains a high rating on Apple Podcasts. In the summer of 2017, she became a founding member of Black Lives Matter Charlottesville. The group protested against white supremacy insurgency that had taken a hold of the city. She resisted in a variety of ways, including nonviolent direct action, working with a bail fund for activists, sewing a creative arts team, and participating in and later co-founding a media collective. Her essay, The Class of Persons, When UVA's White Supremacist Past Meets Its Future, was published in a collection of essays about the terror events in Charlottesville. She has spoken about the connections between Black liberation and craft for the Smithsonian's African American Craft Summit, the Modern Quilt Guild, and the Center for Craft and more. Thank you both so much for being here. Sandy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here and for having me. So I'm going to share my screen and just introduce the Wax Monument series before we kind of open up into conversation. So the Wax Monument started for me in Charlottesville in 2017 after the Unite the Right rally. Like many, I was there that morning. Well, I'm not sure if I want to center that whole event, but it really left me thinking about monuments. Like, what is the place that they serve in public space? How is the way in which they work and the memories that they hold in our public spaces, like, what is that really doing? After that event, because I was there that morning, like a group of dudes in a pickup truck with Nazi and Confederate flags kind of drove by and like all threw Nazi salutes at me. And there was like police officers standing next to me and they kind of just shrugged their shoulders like, what are you gonna do? And I was like, I'm gonna get out of here. So that was the first day. I was already supposed to be starting grad school in Richmond, but it was the summer before the semester started. So I was supposed to be waiting tables that morning. I was like, you know what? I don't feel safe here. And so I went to Richmond that afternoon and, was met by an entire Monument Avenue when I got there. So I started grad school in Richmond the fall of 2017 after this Unite the Right rally. And so I go from that experience in Charlottesville to wrestling with this entire Monument Avenue and the whole history there in the capital of the state. The capital. So anyways, I'm about to already get sidetracked. But I got really interested in this project of monuments and wanting to share like some of my insights or thoughts through my work in what I was noticing about these monuments. So for one, I noticed that they held space and that space that they sit there in that space. And if that monument says it was built in 1950, 30, whatever, nothing else has been able to occupy that space since that time. And they're permanent in the way that our culture builds monuments. We build these permanent monuments that don't change with the times like everything around them, but they continue to influence the culture. They sort of have this way of reifying ideology and extending it into culture, into our subconscious, regardless of whether or not we want them to. And so I started 3D scanning these monuments or finding 3D scans of them, shrinking them down, making molds of them, and then casting them in wax. And so my strategy was kind of, 3 parts where I wanted to miniaturize them. So diminishing them in scale allows them to be mobile. They're these giant things that cost millions of dollars to move at this point. So to make them mobile, was kind of like, okay, that's one way of dealing with this thing. Then multiplying them was a second way of dealing with this thing. You know, it's this one singular structure that in turn garners all of this reverence and all of this, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it sits there and it becomes part of our history, quote unquote. And so it again becomes so immobile because of the way in which it relates to our understanding of what history is. So by making that thing plural and sharing it with people, again, was part of that strategy. And then changing the material was kind of the third way I was thinking about it. So taking that material from bronze and turning it to wax, as people might know, you know, those bronze statues are made through a lost wax process. So they make a wax model of something, they encase it in plaster or a sort of plaster sand mixture, melt out all the wax, and then cast bronze in that space. So by turning them to wax, not only was I making them malleable, but it also is kind of reversing the time on those things. So it's like turning them back to that state when they are malleable and still able to transform. So that's kind of where I started. I was like, this is my sort of anti-monument. And I started distributing them and making it available to people, giving people agency around it. This is the statue of Thomas Jefferson that's on the lawn at UVA. So I scanned that one. That was like the first one. I had like an iPad with a 3D scanner on it. I like climbed the tree to get all the good angles, and then went back to Richmond, printed it, made a mold of it. This was the Lincoln Memorial. So I found this version online. And then the third one I have to show today is the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia. So already, you know, like it started as a conversation about the Confederate monuments, but very quickly I was like, you know, it's really about monument culture for me. Because like, I'm not, you know, because almost like at first people were like really excited to burn down this Lee monument. And I was too, but the way people were excited about it, I was like, all right, like, but this conversation needs to go deeper, you know, because like, sure, we can burn this person who's obviously, you know, not even here anymore in so many different ways. You know, it's easy territory kind of to be burning down Lee at this point. But then when I brought Lincoln into the conversation, you know, a lot of liberal leaning people were like, whoa, Lincoln, you know, isn't he, you know, the hero of Black people though? Don't y'all love Lincoln? Isn't that your favorite president? And again, like, I don't think we even have time to get into who Lincoln is and like how that mythology has changed over time. But I was more interested in having a conversation about what is a monument, and how are we allowing these things to exist in our culture. So like, I don't really try to get into a debate about like the morality of Lincoln, or like, is Lincoln a good guy versus Lee a bad guy? Like for me, it's the way in which we are memorializing these things and how they hold space and how they're used in city planning of a nation that is also holding space, you know, in ways that are highly problematic, and how these monuments are a counterpart to that practice of like colonization and nation building and holding space. So I started distributing these little waxes and giving them to people, giving people the opportunity to melt and hold these things. I had another thought, but I'll keep moving. Right. So, and the other part about it was like, these things were still like very highly surveilled. because I started melting these monuments in front of the monuments they were made after. So again, this is the Jefferson in front of Jefferson. And that one was on 24-hour surveillance. If you go there right now, I think there's a person in a green shirt that will like approach you, ask you what you're doing there. It was the same thing with the Lincoln Memorial. Like they told me, I went there to melt a candle. I gave them my spiel about, I'm just a student working on a school project. And he was like, that's all good. If you melt that candle here, like on the marble, I will arrest you. Like you have to go down past the marble and like 20 feet past that. And I'll give you like 20 minutes to do your project. And then somebody's going to call me and report you. And then you'll have 10 minutes after that before I ask you to leave. So like, 2017 to 2020, this work was also like trying to make something that was impossible possible. Like these were untouchable things. And so making them, giving people agency over these forms seemed like a radical way of intervening in that space that was so policed and so heavily bureaucratic until 2020, when like that seal just burst and people just started tearing shit down and like tagging. So this is when I first made the Lee candle, like I was not allowed to do this. My friends got arrested doing a performance in front of the Lee. Like it was this dead space that nobody was allowed to touch. And so after the protests that happened after George Floyd's murder, people just started tearing monuments down in Richmond and tagging them to hell. And all of a sudden this space was alive again. It went from being this dead space where nobody was allowed to touch anything, nobody's allowed to change anything, like the only thing that was important was the maintenance of that space. And it became alive with just all of this activity of people engaging with the space. They were making gardens, setting up basketball hoops, all the big national magazines were coming to take pictures to, in awe of this liberated space. And it suddenly just became this like, of course, this is what we should be doing. And it was kind of like the energy that these monument candles were trying to conjure. I actually had all these proposals out for like projects I wanted to do to keep pushing these conversations along that after these protests became totally invalid. Like there was no point in doing the projects I had planned anymore because people just did it. So I don't want to ramble on too long, but this was another project I did in Richmond that was cleaning. There's a replica Statue of Liberty in Chimborazo Park in Richmond. This again was in 2018, before the events of 2020. Still engaging in thinking about what is this public space. And so I just was like, I just want to clean this little Statue of Liberty replica that nobody even knows is there. I just want to clean it and like have a community cleaning of it and like activate this thing and pull it back into the contemporary. It's this weird Statue of Liberty that was put there in the 50s by what was called the Boy Scouts of Robert E. Lee during segregation. So it's like all these crazy histories like packed into this little statue that nobody cares about anymore. I just want to come here and clean it and like have a community put hands on it. And that took months of getting permission from the Richmond police, getting permission from Parks and Recreation, getting permission from the little community organization that governs the park, that part of the park, because there's two different organizations that govern that park. And in just planning for this event, it became this practice in bureaucracy again, and just like revealing these layers of red tape that govern this space that is supposed to be this public park that everybody should be able to enjoy. But as soon as you try to step just a little bit beyond that boundary, you run into all of these barriers. And even after I got all of that permission, people would come up to me and harass me about saying I didn't have a right to be cleaning that thing, who gave me permission, like the patina is part of the history of the object. People work hard for those patinas and I'm ruining it. So it again was just this like simple thing I thought I was doing that became this whole revealing effort in understanding like what is public space and where does it lack freedom, and how are these spaces actually unemancipated, is kind of how I started thinking about it. So anyways, that leads to the project I did at Socrates. Was the first public wax monument that I got to make. It was 6 feet tall by 11 feet wide, 3,000 pounds of wax, that people were invited after, I spent about a month pouring this thing layer by layer. And then people were invited to come and melt it and carve it and, do what they wanted with it. But like, it was this, I wanted to create this sort of democracy, like where together we decide what our aesthetic surroundings look and feel like. And like, it's always so fun because like kids are the first people to just like run to this thing and just like, let's do it. Like they're so unabashed in like, it kind of looks like the US flag. So it's got all that symbolics to it and things like that. But I don't know, the visual like setting of the candle lights. I think when I talk about it at first, people think like, oh, you're like out here burning flags. But then when we actually do the thing, it really is this more somber, meditative, visual like atmosphere where people really do come to this thing with consideration, with this like gentle understanding of like what it means to get to do this thing together. These are just some images of people melting it and enjoying the space. And so that brings me to, so that one was called like Wax Monument number 4, parentheses, free wax 1.1. Calling it free wax because, it was free wax. Like people literally would just come and take it, like take chunks of it. And so the iteration that I made for this situated knowledge exhibition was Wax Monument number 7, free wax 2.2, because it's the second form of the free wax. There's actually another one of these in Canada right now being finished. But I kind of approach the cross as a similar symbol, as this thing that exists in public space and has actually, at this point, is so far from its origin source, to the point where we're again not allowed to talk about what this thing means and what it's doing in our spaces and how it's holding space and who gets to put the tape around what that space is and who gets to touch that thing, who gets to burn that form, what melting that form means, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like, I think maybe a good place for me to stop lecturing. And Lisa, if you wanna.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much, Sandy, for that beautiful presentation. It was really wonderful to hear you directly talk about your work this way. I guess I'm going to ask, with one of the questions that came up for me when you were speaking was, who is we? Who is we? I saw this meme once that said, if you want to make a Black person mad, say we when it ain't got shit to do with them. Because when you said we built these monuments, I was like, what now? I did not build any monuments. These monuments were built by some white folks who wanted to worship white folks. So can you talk a bit about how your challenge to, as you say, you want to task audiences with agency. How do you aim to do that in order to understand different roles, different forms of accountability? Like, everyone's going to look at these things differently, but especially in Virginia, as you know, as a native of Virginia, we have had our history erased, distorted, and shaped by the Daughters of the Confederacy. I was so stunned when you said that the Boy Scouts of Robert E. Lee, and I was like, wait, what? How how did Robert E. Lee even have a chapter of the Boy Scouts? Because that was of America. He wasn't really about America like that. So like, I'm so confused. And then I looked it up and I was like, oh my gosh, people are awful. They kept that name. They kept that name until 2013. Or maybe, and people were crying about it. Oh no, we can't have our Boy Scout chapter named after Robert E. Lee anymore. Who's next? Stonewall Jackson? I'm like, bitch, I hope so. So can you talk a bit about how the notion of we and memorial culture, what that means to you in your work, when someone comes up there with a lighter, with a match, with something to participate in this wax monument you've created?
For sure. So I guess like to start with like the idea of tasking people with agency. And again, you know, this whole project started where I was just having so much, you know, I couldn't even like take a picture in front of these things of the thing melting, you know, like you know, it took months to like scrub some patina off. So I was like, there's just no freedom in these spaces. So just like making these little candles that represent the forms that we're not allowed to touch and giving people agency over those forms, I think was like my first, like step one in my mind. And that agency really, I think is like, a lot of people buy these candles and don't do anything with them. You know, like they sit on their shelves. I see them all the time unmelted, but that's up to them, right? Like people, like that was a big question, I think, in grad school. They were like, well, what if somebody buys this statue of Robert E. Lee who loves Robert E. Lee? You know, like how do you make sure like they have to melt it? And I was like, honestly, I think that goes beyond what I'm interested in. Like I want to give them the potential, right, to do what they want with this thing, to have it how they want to. And then what they do with it in their house is really up to them, you know, like, and that was even something I had to like digest and negotiate with myself, like what is my goal here, and like how, you know, like where am I really drawing my own lines?
Yes.
So yeah, like people have definitely bought Robert E. Lee's from me that like Robert E. Lee. They're like, oh, my husband's a real history buff. He really loves, and you know, that's for them. But then these public sculptures where it really is this thing that we all have to put things into together. I think that's in the statement, you know, it's like public and private opportunities for agency. And so I think those are acting against all of these other sculptures that are even it still happens very much in the same way as like when the Daughters of the Confederacy put up those the Confederate statues in Richmond. You know, there's like this big grant funded by somebody like the Daughters of the Confederacy or whoever, you know, right now, like I guess the state of Virginia is funding it, but then it goes through all these levels of filtration where only the board of the museum gets to decide who's worthy of creating the sculpture that gets plopped there. You know, there's like, again, no real participation in deciding what that thing looks like. Because I've both been on selection committees and like applied to be a part of those things. And there's just so many layers. By the time it gets finished, it's very often this sterilized object that's supposed to make everybody happy. It's supposed to just sit there for 30 years and they don't want to have to do any maintenance on it. It's just supposed to be like, we throw $20,000 at it or $1 million at it and then it's done. And my sculptures really function against that, that idea or that like function of what that sculpture, like what public space should be about. Because they're so temporary, they require like so much, I really think of them as offerings because I put so much at labor that I almost never get compensated for. Just my time of just like, you know, stringing these wicks together, building the mold. In Canada, I actually built a mold recently. It was like of a 10-foot cross and the next night people had destroyed it. So I had to come back the next day and put it back together and say, I'm still gonna make this for you. You know, I'm still gonna spend all day wicking this thing. I'm still gonna spend the next week pouring the wax, so that other people have an opportunity to touch this thing, you know, to touch something in public space and feel like they left a mark somewhere, and they were allowed to. You know, it wasn't graffiti, it wasn't vandalism. The way people were yelling, like somebody called the cops on me when I was grubbing that Statue of Liberty, and reported me of vandalism. So it's just these lines that I'm trying to break down and give people the opportunity to step over without like some of those negative repercussions that I experienced.
I really appreciate this invitation to agency, because that is exactly what it is. There are some people who, you know, don't mind tagging a statue because, you know, fuck that statue. But also there are folks who, you know, who want to participate in a different and better way of knowing what public space is and should be. I believe that the monuments that we have been fortunate enough to get rid of here in Charlottesville, after years and years of advocacy and petitions and protests and meetings, and finally someone being murdered and dozens of people being injured and people being traumatized. You know, I think I was there for the day when they removed the Lee statue, and my only thought was, no one had to die for this. No one had to die for this. It was not worth it. And what we end up with is this result that becomes sedimented as if it were an incontrovertible fact. And these are not incontrovertible facts. These are presences that have been erected in a community for a specific purpose. And the purpose here in Charlottesville, as in Richmond, I believe, was to delineate white space. And so when I hear you say that this notion that just as soon as you put a statue of some white man, particularly a white man who kind of upholds the dominant racist narratives of American quote unquote democracy, it's meant to be unassailable. That it does not surprise me at all that someone would call the police on you for cleaning the statue, just like they would call the police on you if you were spraying it with, you know, some Krylon. Either anything you do to touch it is somehow a crime, which we should all be really concerned about. That is something that everyone should be worried about, I think.
For sure. And like, it was very much like, why are you touching it? You know, because like after the first day, I started like having my friends come with me. And when it was me and my brother, we still got like, what are y'all doing? You know, but when I had my white friends there, people didn't bother us. And when I put on my like, you know, safety vest, so I look like I'm just doing labor, again, I become this invisible thing that's supposed to be there. But it was very much about like, who's allowed to touch that thing? And I guess I'm trying to flip that and say, who gets to say who's allowed to do things? Like who, because, you know, these people who were policing me weren't the police.
No.
I got permission from the police, but they embody policing, which is something I think that they get out of those monuments. You know, like when all these white men heralding over the land, or whatever phrase you want to use, that's how people start to associate things and understand things. It really creates what's normal in that space.
Yes. And I really appreciate how you shared that you had to bring some white friends with you. That is how I learned to cross the street on the corner. I wait for, you know, it's really busy. You've been here. So, you know, it gets really busy right there, like in front of Mincer's or whatever. My policy is to wait for a white girl.
Yeah.
And they don't look, they just go. And the car stopped. And I'm like, all right, I'm going.
Yep.
It's worked like really well.
It does.
It does feel like what you've described is what it means to reclaim space, to reclaim and to force folks to reckon with the legacy, the very limited and narrow legacy of these particular objects. That they were so, particularly the Confederate ones, they were so rooted in its white supremacy and its reverence for the Confederacy that even all these years later, that you could present a Black threat that would need to be
Absolutely.
defended against. It's interesting to me how you describe folks feeling deputized to defend these monuments from you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really compelling story.
Thank you. It's real, you know.
It's just, and none of it is surprising. And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the things I wanted to think about with the wax monuments is the question of wax itself. And I really appreciate how you described how a bronze sculpture is made, that wax is an important part of that construction process. One of the things I wanted to hear a bit more about is the choice of wax itself, right? So one of the things I was thinking about your work is the idea that it feels very kinetic, that you walk up to you approach the sculpture, you touch it with fire, you get to see it transform. It's hit so many of your senses because
Mm-hmm.
you can watch it, you can hear it, you can feel the heat from the flame, you can smell the wax coming up. It really does kind of get you involved in a way that any other kind of more passive consumption would do. Have you heard any feedback from folks who have participated in your installations that have they been able to respond or share with you in some ways that they have felt like they have exercised agency that day?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the photos I was sharing of the big wax monument in New York were sent to me through Instagram. While that sculpture was up, the 6 months it was installed, people sent me notes, messages, pictures. I got poems sometimes of just people really appreciating like what that thing was doing in their surroundings. And yeah, the material of wax, the more I've worked with it, the more I'm just so inspired by the potential it has. You know, it sits right on this state of like almost transforming, where like it just takes a little match, a little wick, and it totally transforms. And I think it also, I've been thinking like it sort of defeats this idea that change amounts to the destruction of something. Like to change something means we are destroying history, we're erasing the past. Because when you watch that wax melt and change, that wax doesn't disappear. You know, it reforms, it recollects. Like that material, that potential, I think like we can extend it symbolically or metaphorically to like the resources of our society. And thinking that, you know, like to change the way we organize these things, who organizes these things, isn't the destruction of all these things that we've assembled. You know, it's just that form taking new shape. And so I really love wax for all those reasons you said, and then just to add those ideas of just the way in which that potential works, I find really exciting too.
I really like that, because wax is both a noun and a verb, right? That you can do the act of waxing something to polish it, but also it's a form of speech. You know, like when they say you might wax poetic about a thing. And so I really appreciate the way that the Situated Knowledge exhibition that's here in town talks about gestures, and thinking about this as a gesture. And I'm wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit about the gesture of the cross, for example, and why you might think someone would destroy that. I'm not asking you to, you know, you can't, of course, anticipate, but I think your interpretation, I'm curious about your interpretation as an artist, someone who has created something. And then one of the forms of engagement in the public has been to destroy it. What do you think about that?
Well, I've got two answers. Because with the with the Canada situation, that was actually the most unnerving. I don't know, the saddest part of it. I was like, I wish they had left a note, because they were like, because afterwards, the next morning we came in, I'm dealing with this gallery that I've been working with now for a while on this project. And they were like, well, it was either a pro-religious person who saw this as a disrespectful gesture to their religion and wanted to destroy the potential of you working on something, or it was an anti-religious person that saw this thing and thought you were just erecting one of the another cross, because there's a lot of churches around, so they thought you were erecting another cross, and so they didn't want that to happen. Or it was an anti-Black person who saw you working on this thing earlier and just didn't like you.
Wow.
Or it was a bunch of drunk teenagers, just goofing off, and decided to like break your thing because it looked well made and breakable. So, and they're like, but we're not surprised this happened. And that was the part that was really, to me, I'm like, if you weren't surprised, why didn't we prepare for this? Like, why didn't we put up it's just like, because now I feel like hyper visible, kind of unsafe in this, I'm just miles away from home working, I'm just here working on this one project, and now you're telling me I should feel unsafe, or I should feel suspicious because you're telling me there's like people around who don't like Black people, there's people around that really love, and it's, again, that is the world we live in. But it was still like, I don't know, it was disappointing.
Yeah.
But I guess the other question, was like, why am I making crosses?
Or I guess because I was thinking about it in the context of the cross burning that happened in Charlottesville that you also talked about. I believe this was in the 40s. And the newspaper reported it saying there was no real motive. No one knows why. I was just like, what kind of nonsense of an article is this?
I know, but it was so, the Canada situation was so funny to me because we basically had to write the same police report. They were just like, the motives are unclear, like they destroyed it, but who knows why? And like, of course, when people were burning crosses in Charlottesville, I think they probably knew why. In fact, a lot of the records I've been finding around Virginia, the police played parts in it.
Yes.
And so I think all of those dynamics are really interesting to, again, bring into a conversation of like, yeah, why were they burning crosses? Like, what does that mean? Like, why do people wear these like Roman torture devices as neck? It's like, what does it really mean? And again, I'm not trying to, it's like, I never approach these things with like this sort of like disrespect. Like I'm just trying to like, talk down to someone's faith. Like it really is like a genuine, I really want to reinvigorate these things and pull them, like I was saying with the statue, like pull them back into a contemporary conversation.
Yes.
So they're not just these dead things that nobody's allowed to touch, nobody's allowed to play with, except, like, again, like a lot of people do wear, like a lot of people wear crosses who are not religious. Like it's a fashion statement at this point, like all the like so many celebrities wear crosses and like have nothing to do with any sort of like church or faith. It's a fashion statement. And like, I don't know, to go more into the history of it, it didn't even start as a Christian thing. It was like a pagan thing that got pulled into Christianity. Again, like a lot of the way symbols work.
Yes.
So again, like we can have these conversations about Lincoln too, and about Jefferson, and about, like all of these characters that become mythologized over time to the point where they're just these symbols that certain people construct narratives around. And then there's just this red tape that nobody's allowed to touch. after that time. And so it's, to me, just about like reinvigorating that conversation. And like, especially, you know, I teach at the University of Richmond. Like I work with students who all the time I'm like, you know, they're wearing like a Rolling Stones t-shirt. I'm like, oh, you listen to the Rolling Stones? They're like, who's the like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's like this, oh, I just bought this because it was that Hot Topic, and it means cool, you know.
Yes, it does.
It's like, wow, like let's unpack that though.
That's right. No, it's true. And I really appreciate the response, because what it's allowing me to think of is, again, that these are not timeless. These are not timeless objects. And that particularly when we think about memorial culture, who gets to create that which will be memorialized? And that, I think, is what you are asking us to think about. We have a good question here that I wanted to ask you. Someone was asking if someone bought a Robert E. Lee candle from a museum gift shop rather from you, does that make a difference to you? Do you care about the market or the manner in which your work is sold?
I'm myself still negotiating how those logistics work. You know, like what they don't teach you in art school is that you're basically starting a small business. And so that has been my journey after my MFA, is like, wow, like I own a business now. And what are the ethics of my practices? You know, like, first of all, how do you make a profit? You know, because all of my money is either goes into the project, and then on top of that, all my labor is just volunteer. So already, like, I'm very much not a great business model. But I guess like the short answer is I would be okay with someone buying it from a museum, gift shop. Like I am working on the way things are packaged, the information that comes with that thing, the history, like just like what I include in that thing that you're buying, so that if you buy it from a museum in the future, it's still like, it's not like we're talking about, it's not this thing that's decontextualized from its source. Like it carries with it all of that information. But then I hope that we also build networks where, you know, the profits that the museum might get from selling that thing go to, you know, some organization in the community. You know, it's not just like this symbolic gesture, but it's also trying to do the work that it's talking about. So if, you know, like when I first started selling these things, like almost all the profits were going to youth organizations in Richmond, specifically historically Black youth organizations in historically Black neighborhoods. So, and was my idea of like, okay, like we're doing this thing, we're selling this object, but also like it has to be doing some of the work that we are sort of like signaling the need for. So that's kind of, you know, you can't buy it from a museum yet. But if we were doing that, that's how I would want to negotiate the logistics or the way that whole situation works.
I appreciate that. I really do. And what I'm wrestling with, as you are, is this relationship between art and capitalism. This notion of objects. And you mentioned that some of your work, some of the photos that have come to you have come from Instagram. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that additional layer of interpretation, that you have folks who are engaging with your work in real life and also documenting themselves doing so, and then sharing that documentation through Instagram, which gives a different level or layer of meaning altogether. Have you found that social media has been an environment that has represented your work well? Has it allowed you? I know, for example, for a lot of organizers, social media has been critical to help getting messages out. Black Lives Matter, the hashtag first started through those 3 Black queer women talking about Trayvon Martin's, you know, murder and exoneration for the killer, right on social media. And so I know there are some folks who have found that to be a very disingenuous and dangerous space, and I believe it is. It's also a space that has great potential for liberatory practices. Where do you land on that? Or is it a both and?
I think at this point I'd have to both and it. Like, I mean, I don't think we even have time tonight to get into like the tech regimes that are like lobbying, you know, like are part of the political culture, and you know, it's just like a huge conversation, and like where these industries, how much control they have over our day to day. Where, you know, as soon as we make like, you know, a Black owned, you know, like queer centered social media, like I'm all for it. I'm here. Like I'll definitely delete my Instagram. But it was this nice thing where like people were just, they were sending me direct messages of just like, thank you for your piece. Like, you know, I've got like pictures of like kids like standing on top of it, and like, you know, like families melting it together. Like I said, just like getting those messages, it was a really important part of the work for me, because it I don't know, it just validated this thing where I was like, in starting that project in particular, and the crosses similarly, you know, it was so nervous to be doing that work. You know, I'm always like, I've always got my mom behind me. Like before I started making the crosses, she was just like, oh, please don't do that. Like, please don't. Like, people are gonna hate it. You know, it's gonna be, it is, you know, it's just because understanding the realities of this world, you know, like that's how she had to like raise me to protect me, like growing up, you know, like don't run in your street clothes because people will think you stole something, you know, like don't have your hands in your pockets when you're in the store, because et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
It's part of that, like raising a Black youth, and that you like are like, don't do that because white people will shut you down. So I was nervous to bring that work into the world. And it was really it felt so good to get that positivity, that like people just didn't immediately want to shut it down and deny it, but they were like, wow, this like, in living with this work, we really appreciate what it does. So Instagram was really vital for that. But again, like if there were another platform, I would use that too.
I too would be very, very interested in a Black queer centered social media environment. I would absolutely sign up.
Totally.
I want to keep an eye on our time and honor our time. I see Lindsay here popping in. I don't know if there's any other questions or if I get a chance to ask one last one. Lindsay, how are we doing?
You can ask one last question. Go for it.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Now I got so many on here. I'm trying to decide. Okay. This is one of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking, Octavia Butler, one of my faves. I absolutely love her and her work. And in one of her books, I think this is the parable of the first parable book, she says, in order to rise, a phoenix first must burn. And I keep thinking about burning and fire and how that has been used against Black folks, in particular in acts of racial terror. What do you think, or do you think there is some kind of connection between the Wax Monument series, allowing people to individually, that wonderful image of you at the Richmond Lee statue holding it and with the lighter, do you think there's a connection at all in the transformative property, the liberation properties of fire, and the destructive and intimidating versions?
I think it's trying to like subvert that connotation, because like, just like with the, you know, like people were burning crosses to like instill segregation, you know, like et cetera, you know, like to as an anti-Black gesture.
Yes.
And so to kind of reclaim that gesture, for instance, with the cross, and like recontextualize, you know, like it's not this like pro-white I don't know, gesture. We're like we're subverting it, we're reclaiming it, we're like rethinking what that act can look like, what that flame can be used for. And I think like I work across those, like playing with those symbolics a lot, where like, you know, a rope that can be used to make a noose can be used to make something else, right? And like, so I'm often like, you know, don't give capitalism so much credit. Don't give like white supremacy so much credit. Like they didn't invent fire. They just made it this like terrible, scary thing. We have to like take that thing back and reclaim it. You know, like Donald Trump did not invent the red hat. You know, he just like made it this thing that nobody can wear, but it will take somebody reinvigorating that space to be like, no, like he didn't invent the hat. He took the phrase from Reagan. Like nothing original happened in that except for people forgetting history.
Yes.
And so that's kind of where I sit with that. Is like, I'm often just like, how can we reclaim that space and make it safe again?
Yes. Wow. Thank you so much, Sandy. I am so grateful to be in conversation with you. This has been a wonderful evening. We've got some wonderful notes in the chat talking about swords into plowshares, which I can definitely tell you more about, as well as some information here about things that are going to be happening here at New City Arts. Yes, check out my podcast. I absolutely love it. We've got work from the other artists who are available. And if you know of a creative project that needs funding, check out the Charlottesville Soup, the TV dinner edition. We did that last year. Was it last year or was it earlier this year?
Yeah, last year.
It was so much fun. I was the host. It was obviously amazing. I had a great time. And the food was good. And there was some kind of bread pudding. These are all things that are in my mind right now. So just check out the wonderful things that Lindsay has included for us to think about in the chat. Lindsay, did you want to say a few final words?
I just want to say thank you so much. This was wonderful. Yeah. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for being here, everybody. Have a wonderful night. Keep in touch. You can find out more about Sandy and their work on their webpage, as well as at New City Arts. Go in. If you haven't had a chance to stop by the Welcome Gallery, do pop in and see this fantastic work for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Sandy. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Pleasure meeting you as well. Good night, y'all.
Good night.
Night.